Well, hi, and thank you so much for having us here at the virtual Grand Slam Coaches Conference. I'm Marc Sophoulis from the Melbourne International Tennis School and the Tennis Menu, where Shane and I work together a lot, and we also do a podcast called Crunching the Numbers, and it's where the art meets the science. And I'd like to introduce Shane LIyanage from Data Driven Sports Analytics. Shane, thanks for obviously doing this with me today, and obviously we do this on a weekly basis on our podcast, but it's really nice to actually do this for the Australian coaches.
Yeah, thanks, Marc, and I'm very honoured to have been invited to present here. And like Marc said, we catch up and do this weekly on our podcast, but it's great to come out to such a great audience like yourselves.
And thanks, Shane. And you've obviously got a great, obviously rich history of data, working with data, and obviously, you know, you've done a lot of work with ATP, WTA players. Obviously, the well-known ones, obviously Thomas Fabiano and Ons Jabeur, who you're still currently working with, as well as many others. And the work that you do, obviously, just give us a little bit of an insight as to what you do from a data perspective.
Yeah. Look, I've been in data roles for over a decade now, in a number of different industries, but probably in the last 5 years I've pivoted to doing it a little bit more in the sports industry. So I'm the lead analytics lead in Cricket Australia for community cricket, working largely with operational data, but also some of the performance data with the indoor team. And yes, like Marc said, I've been working with some ATP and WTA players, really just video analysis, and then pulling data from their matches and trying to look for insights, both from a long-term point of view and against opponents as well.
And obviously working together, we've had some great success, obviously working with a lot of players, but notably probably the 2020 Australian Open Junior Boys Doubles, where we teamed together with Nicholas David Ionel from Romania with his partner Leandro Aridi, and we obviously won the Grand Slam there, and just due to obviously great team connection, but utilising a lot of this data, which we're going to go through today, to show probably all of you how we utilise the data in the best way for our athletes.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks very much for inviting me to that. It was a great experience really being part of that team, and loved really seeing the way you work with the athletes.
Thanks, mate. It was really good fun. I actually quite enjoyed it, and it's always good when you're winning, isn't it? It's not so good when you're losing. So thanks once again. But we're going to get stuck into it, Shane, and obviously we're here to talk about the art and the science of coaching. And I know where my head sits, and I know where your head sits.
Science first, right?
And we always have this debate every time we're together. But obviously, I'm an art man, and I always talk about the art coming first in anything that we do in terms of working with athletes. And the reason I want to bring that up, Shane, is obviously without any kind of connection and relationship that a coach has, it's, you know, you can imprint any kind of knowledge or data or anything that you want to an athlete, but without that trust and that buy-in, obviously it becomes really challenging to get the point across. And obviously the art for me is the number one priority, and I utilize, and I don't ever discount science. Science to me is what the factual information is, but I really feel like from my perspective, if I'm not connected with my athlete, no matter what you give me, it's very hard for me to get that point across to my players.
No, it's a really good point. And I think if you'd spoken to me maybe 3-4 years ago, I'd be very much in the science first camp. But having been involved in a few teams, including your own, I really see the value in that sort of precursor work, really establishing the relationship, understanding how the athlete ticks and how they're going to take the data in. And I think I'm going to go against my brethren here and probably say art needs to go first.
Oh, well, all the data scientists out there can actually close their eyes and cover their ears and not listen to that, because I mean, look, it's there's no doubt the science is critical to creating success and understanding, you know, the numbers behind everything. But obviously, like you said, without that art, I think it's really it's not going anywhere, and the communication breakdown can be quite significant if you don't have that connection, that buy-in. Shane, so I'm going to get you to touch on this one. I think this is obviously your bread and butter, but why do we need to use analytics? And obviously this is a great slide to illustrate the reasons behind a lot of the clubs and teams around the world utilizing it now.
Yeah, I mean, to put it bluntly, the teams or the athletes that are using it have done better, statistically have done better. They've won more matches, or they've been had more team success than the non-adopters. So I think there's been sufficient information on that for the last 4 or 5 years to say that the adopters do it better. And it's not just at the very top level. These associations, organisations, they're using data or have an analytics-led approach at the grassroots level, and with their pathways program. So I think that's a really important point I want to stress. It's not just for the very top. It should be embedded within the organisation. And Marc and I have separate roles, and I'll get Marc to sort of touch on his AFL, but I work in Cricket Australia, as I mentioned, and a lot of my work is with community cricket, so grassroots, and looking at data from the game. So looking at junior formats, are players hitting enough boundaries? Are they taking enough wickets? So looking at it from an operational point of view, but also with the lens of how do we get these athletes from grassroots to the high performance and playing for Australia potentially one day.
Yeah, and it's important because you're utilising the most important stats, and I'm big on KPIs and which key performance indicators actually for each individual athlete on the tennis court is going to help them win matches and obviously become the best player they can be. And whether it's first serve percentage wins, or whether it's minimizing double faults for younger kids, or whether it's utilizing their best stroke, which may be their forehand, it's important to have the numbers to back up your opinions as a coach. And I feel like using analytics actually shows the player that it's not just your opinion, but it's also backed up by factual information. So I think it's really critical. And obviously in AFL, I've been fortunate enough to work at the Richmond Footy Club for a long period of time, and we use data on an instantaneous perspective during the game, and we look at our KPIs as the game's going on, but also at the end of games we obviously measure our success based on our KPIs, and that's a real key performance indicator for us.
Might turn it over to you, Marc, because I'm really keen to get your perspective on how the data should be used.
Yeah, look, data needs to be used in multiple ways. Obviously, science of coaching comes in from numbers through to vision, and obviously getting the player to learn through different stimuli. But there's no doubt data gives me the ability to get the buy-in from the athlete. And as I just mentioned earlier, I think the biggest thing is when you talk to a player, you want them to know that you're not just telling them something for the sake of telling them. You want it to be, backed up by something that is measurable. And getting that buy-in is critical. So using the numbers with a lot of my players these days, and since I've been starting to work with you a lot more, obviously I use it a hell of a lot more than I used to, but players are now actually buying in a lot deeper to my messaging, because I'm able to show them both through numbers and visual examples. And with the world being 65% visual learners, I think to me that is a critical component of how players are going to obviously access this information from me. And then with that information, I can help structure training and prioritize training. And that to me is critical because, as a coach, I used to just do, bits and pieces of everything. But when you've actually got numbers in front of you and obviously your KPIs aren't being met, you can focus in on those bigger based KPIs more than anything else. And the success that I've been able to have over the last few years just by changing my priorities to the numbers and actually having measurable bits of information, I think is critical, because a player now believes me a lot more than when it was just an opinion, when my eyes were telling me what I thought they were seeing. And that was probably the most important. And I think, you've helped me hone in my ability to do that, Shane, and through what you do. And I know you throw out, and we'll go through it later, but you give me a lot of information. And the art of coaching is the ability to take the information that you need, not every bit of information that you get.
Yeah, and I think we'll certainly touch on the prioritization, because it is a key thing, very much part of the process. I do want to sort of mention tennis is a complicated open skill sport. There's lots of combinations. There's lots of potential data that you can capture, and I think that prioritization is critical to getting the right information at the right time.
Yeah, correct. Spot on. Yeah, this is a good slide. Now I'll get you to go through this, Shane, and give us some numbers. But what we wanted to do in this slide is to give the coach out there, which is you guys watching this, the ability to have some KPIs that the top level of the game is doing. And what we wanted to, the reason we want to do this is because a lot of the time we are so present with our coaching and not projecting forward to where the athlete needs to be in the future. And I feel like we can do a lot better job at our development if we knew what the game was doing at the top end, to be able to then structure our stuff from a coaching perspective at the lower and grassroots end. But Shane, do you want to go through some of these numbers and let's have a chat through it a little bit?
Yeah, and apologies to those that are listening. We're probably running through this slide a lot quicker than it probably deserves in reality, probably a presentation on its own. But hitting versus non-hitting time, this is a big one that Marc and I use. And hitting is when you're actually hitting a ball, and non-hitting is things like in between a point, change of ends. So if you look at those numbers, 25% and 75%, the most of the time your athlete is in between a point or not hitting a ball. So that mental side is really critical. Another one which is one Marc and I have looked at is score probability. So if you get to 15 love, particularly on the men's side, your probability of winning is at 85%. So the importance of the first point is highlighted in some of the work that we've done together. Other key ones are, 70% of outcomes are errors. So it's just, how are you structuring your game around it? And I know Marc will elaborate on some of these as well. Depth versus width, is your ball sort of cutting the sideline or the baseline first? And obviously the 0 to 4, 5 to 8, 9 plus, it's been certainly brought into the attention of tennis for the last, a decade. It's still a critical part of how the game is played.
You're right, Shane. And I think it's like these numbers are important. And I hope, the coach out there that's watching, you guys are taking, some notes about the numbers itself. But it's not just the numbers, it's how we utilize them. And I think, we hear it all the time, 70% of points are finishing in 4 shots. Now, that's not a matter of trying to finish the point within that time. It's just making sure that you can allow your athlete to set up the point with their serve and their first strike and trying to get first strike in the rally. Now, if the point goes a little bit further than that, it's so be it. But I think it's the critical aspect of anything that we do with numbers is understanding the reasons behind them and utilizing them to the best of your ability. So, don't try and finish a shot within 4 shots finish the point in 4 shots. Actually try and set up the point with those first 2 balls that you have. Are you working on the mindset? Now, for me, it's critical that our athletes from a junior level are understanding about the mindset and about the planning and about, how to reset in between points and how to reset in between games and what to think, because 75%, as you alluded to, Shane, is time that we are not hitting balls. And that is a critical aspect of my coaching. Is I coach from the inside out. And that means I'm coaching from thoughts, because thoughts create action. So it's the thinking processes that we need to get better at. And the other one that you did mention, that 70% errors. We play an error game. Tennis is an error-based game. Now, we always talk about hitting winners, as coaches, and to hit the big shot, hit the winner, but it's about forcing error. And that to me, not only gives you the point, but it also puts the opponent on the back foot and gives them a little bit of self-doubt if they're missing shots. If you're constantly hitting winners past them, they know that they can just hang in there and they can weather the storm, and you may make some more errors, in the long run and actually lose the match. So, if you can look at these numbers and take, your interpretation of them to utilize them in the best way that you possibly can. But, these are some of the key ones that we've spoken about, Shane. Winning the first point in the game is critical. Gaining momentum in matches is really, really important. Second serve is an important aspect of winning matches. So focus in on not just, hitting the big first serve, but the second serve needs to be stable. And obviously depth versus width, you mentioned before. WTA versus ATP, a totally different ball game. So when you're dealing with males and females, please ensure you're dealing with them a little bit differently in terms of the game style.
Well touched on there. Yeah, I thought I'd sort of mention, and this is one both the analyst and the coach probably should have it in their lens and when you're using data. So it's a concept called action constraints, and I'll define it really quickly. It's basically how much time do you actually have to action the data or the feedback that's provided to the athlete. So high latency would be something that takes a lot of time and you need a lot of time to do it, and low latencies where it can be implemented quite quickly. And we'll touch on how this impacts sort of in-tournament analysis versus something where you've got a larger block of time like the preseason. So a couple of examples that we've got on the slide. So and Marc will certainly elaborate a little bit more on this, but a grip change or a ground stroke change or a service action change is going to take a lot longer than something like telling your athlete you need to serve first. And we break that up into technique, tactical, physical, mental. That there are sort of different ends of the spectrum for feedback that we provide.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's a critical thing is, when you do utilize data or you do try to make some quick changes, those big technical changes take time and they take, a lot of repetition and sometimes between tournaments or in season, it's very hard to change. But I know we're going to touch on a few of these sort of things, but, when we look at the tactical changes that you could possibly make, we feel like they are, quick changes that we can make, and have a big impact on the outcome of matches. From that perspective to, obviously the mental side of the game, we can make big inroads in. And I think that's a really big point is where are we going to make the biggest inroads and what's the data going to allow us to do in the space of time that we possibly have. So, that's a really important slide for us is to understand when data can be used and how much you got to use it.
Yeah.
So obviously here, Shane, we're going to break down the three areas in the way that we use data and how we use data. But obviously, the three different ways are, obviously pre-season, during tournament, and obviously for opponent analysis. But if you want to go through an example of a pre-season problem that we did have with one certain player that we've been working with.
Yeah, so in this instance, and this is just one page from I think 3 or 4 that sort of highlighted the issue, but the clear problem that that I was seeing after analysing the data was the level dropped after the first hour. So performance in the first 60 minutes for the 0 to 4, 5 to 8, 9 plus, both on serve and return was at a reasonable level. It was pretty good. It was significantly below that in the second 60 minutes. And I suppose that's the problem. And we'll get Marc to touch on how we approach that.
Yeah, well, if we look a little bit closer, I felt like this athlete, obviously winning 65% of points in the 0 to 4 category in that first hour showed a really significant win for us in that perspective. But the decrease of about 21% here, and obviously as we go along, there was a decrease of 12% here on the 5 to 8, and a decrease of nearly 50% here on the 9 plus. And what we looked at was a real decline in the way that this athlete was going about their match play. And this to me was a real significant, landmark and milestone for me, because this player was so good in that first hour, but just dropped away really poorly. So during a preseason block where we had an 8-week period, what I did was increase the length of training. Obviously physical became more important than the on-court work. And we made sure that this player was actually changing their dietary requirements through that. So what I found out, and over the research of so many matches that Shane did do the data on for me, this player wasn't eating, obviously, probably about an hour before the match. So about the first hour in, this player was, 2 hours without having any food intake and just drinking water only. So I felt like the energy levels were decreasing quite significantly. So we input a lot of food into the plan as well. So we increased training length to 3 hours on court to try and sustain mentality. We probably increased the amount of food intake every 20 minutes. So we had a banana, we had some dried fruit. We included some sports drink as well as water. And the changes have been quite significant through the preseason over the last 7 or 8 weeks. And I'm seeing a really big change in the way this athlete's playing and the levels of energy has been sustained. But we wouldn't have known that had we not have probably gone through, that first 60-minute block here compared to the second 60-minute block. And that was probably the really big ball game changer for me, is understanding what was happening and when it was happening.
I'll move on to the second problem. So we were looking at, and this was probably triggered after a conversation that I had with Marc before that I looked at the data, and we just wanted to look at what the player was doing and the directions that were working for them and the shots that were working, but when they were in attack and when they were in defense. And basically I gave him a breakdown of how often the athlete uses a specific shot and the success they have when that shot's used. So following the point on till its completion. And I highlighted a few where the numbers were really good, and a few where or the ones in red really wanted to sort of reduce or avoid that pattern where possible. And Marc obviously found some gems in there as well that I didn't naturally see myself. So he might sort of touch on the solution there.
Yeah, and that's kind of the thing is, to know your athletes really well. So, the green is obviously where the best patterns of play were. So I felt like this player could utilize the backhand cross corner a lot more than probably what they were doing. Obviously, winning 76% of the points, backhand cross is really important. The other two that I looked at that Shane hasn't highlighted here, but forehand down the line, winning 70% of the points, and backhand down the line, winning 77% of the points, were two areas that I thought were really underutilized. And as you can see, 2.5% of the time, this player goes forehand line to nearly just over 2.5%. They go backhand line. And I'm like, well, if they're going to be winning that ratio of points doing that, why aren't they doing it more? And how do we then set up the points? And, we come up with some certain patterns of play that needed to happen, certain balls that we wanted to take down the line in certain moments when we're in attack. And obviously, Shane obviously has the difference between winning attack and winning defense. And that is obviously a real critical component, because winning defense, we want to be able to get the ball back into counteract in neutral stages of the rally. So, I felt like there was a couple of real gems that we've utilized with this particular player, and it's actually worked an absolute treat. And I think utilizing the numbers where they're most significant actually has changed this player's mindset into a really positive state and knowing what they need to do in those moments. This one here is actually just a continuation of that previous slide where I felt like the player actually played better from the ad court. So if we look at the ad court stats, there's a plus 5% increase in winning ratio on the ad side on serve and a plus 7% on the return. So this player actually, from the previous slide, has a better win-loss ratio from the ad corner. So what we needed to do was actually change the pattern of play so that everything would go to that ad corner. And the results have been significantly different and been a huge difference in the win-loss ratio now. And we're finding that through playing these patterns, they're getting into a corner where they feel most comfortable. And that to me is important from a mindset perspective.
Yeah, another big one, and I think the serve plus one is an area that we look at a lot in tennis. But for this, I actually wanted to break it down for Marc and look at serve plus ones where they use a forehand, backhand, volley, and when they win the point and when they lose the point. And it was really to understand the importance of serve plus one when you're winning points. And then Marc looked at a solution or how we can implement it for a specific athlete.
Yeah, and I think it's important to know which patterns work. And when I broke it down and had a look at this, I really felt like the player was losing a lot more points than they were winning going down the line on the first ball. So what we needed to do was have patterns of when the ball landed in B to really try and get that ball going back from the backhand side to the F and the E. And when it landed in C, we actually went cross as well. So we're looking at the cross-court patterns as being first ball, we needed to go there. Now, this athlete actually, it's actually something I haven't even discussed with you, Shane, but this athlete isn't a great mover and hasn't been a great mover. So when they're on the move, going down the line actually exposed their movement on the first ball. So to go cross on the first ball took away the ability for the player to move them. Now, if the player if my player went from B to F or E and the ball goes here and the opponent goes down the line, they can't spread this player well enough. So therefore, this player is not on the full tilt move. But what I felt was happening a lot of the time was when they were going sort of from B to H, the opponent's first ball was actually almost dissecting the sideline and then putting my player on stretch on the first ball. And that's what we didn't want on a first ball pattern. We wanted the first strike in the rally and we weren't getting it with the down the line ball. And this sort of data gave me the ability to show the player, and the player was able to then change the patterns pretty quickly.
Yeah, next we sort of move away from that sort of big block pre-season to in tournament, where the focus starts to really turn to a little bit more of the opponent. I know Marc's got a great philosophy of still having the player front and center, 80-20 rule as he'll explain. But another thing that I picked up from Marc and doing sort of analysis for him was he really likes to see the tournament reports sort of cut down by serve, return, and balls in play. So I might get you to elaborate on why, Marc.
Yeah, and you alluded to the 80-20, Shane, and the 80-20 for me is critical. So, you work so hard on creating structures and patterns of play for your player, which is your 80% of the play. Your player wants to play maybe from the backhand corner. Maybe they want to, have a significantly good forehand. They want to utilize that as much as possible. They like to serve, to the, flat balls to the backhand corner more often than not. So you don't want to take away what your player does really well. But then also the 20% is the aspect of how we can break the opponent down a little bit up the other end. So it may be a forehand return that's a little bit dodgy. It may be attack their second serve. And when the ball's in play, it might be you need to take away their time and space. That might be as simple as that from a 20% perspective. But I feel like this really gives me the ability to have three plans with the game being so quick. With nearly 70% of points finishing in 4 shots. I feel like the serve and the return and the first ball are the critical components, and the balls in play are the balls that are after those 4 shots and the style of game you want to play.
Yeah. Well, one thing that may not be visible from the visuals on the screen, but we also like to, for each of these categories, look at how the opponent behaves under pressure. So where, the opponent will serve, in a break point situation, or, what are their tendencies under pressure when the ball's in play. So we certainly add that sort of mental element to it as well in the analysis. Probably this slide probably alludes to that, just really cutting the data by the behavior under pressure, when they're ahead and other situations in the match. In this specific example, you can see the player sort of tends to use the body serve a lot more when they're under pressure.
Yeah, and absolutely. And this is something that Shane gives me for my players so that I know what they're doing under those pressure moments. But also when I get this plan against my opponents, I know exactly where they're going to serve at which moments, and I actually get my players sitting on that ball. So it's actually a good way to analyze opponents as well.
Yeah, funny thing as well, in that doubles final that we mentioned, this was something we almost did live on court. We're sitting next to each other, and you can probably tell the story a bit better, but we were both seeing something that unfortunately the players weren't seeing in the heat of the sort of moment. But yeah, I'd love to hear, I think your listeners would love to hear how you sort of dealt with that.
Yeah, well, we actually were having a bit of a joke that you gave us the wrong data before the match, and we were sitting there and we were dissecting the match as it was playing. And it was really interesting because the player was serving a particular pattern, and because I was able to coach at the change of ends, I went down to change of ends, and midway through the second set, after we were down a set and a break, I said, okay, we're sitting on this ball. This is where they're serving it. This is where they're playing it, and this is what we're going to do to counter it. And luckily enough, I think it was just more luck from that perspective. The boys were able to execute it really well, and sat on that ball and ended up winning the match in a super tiebreak in the third set. So it did significantly change the match and the flow.
Yeah, and I think that the whole dynamic with on-court coaching coming will really sort of revolutionize how coaching happens, how analysis happens. But it's probably a topic for another day. And then look at this next category of reports, really reports that happen sort of within a tournament where you probably don't have a lot of time, but you've got a little bit more than a day. And this specific example was a report that I did for one of the players that we worked together with, and something I noticed quite early, just analysing his matches, was he was a very slow starter. So it sort of prompted me to sort of dig into this and have a look at a few things, at how he started and how he behaved under pressure. And yes, one of the, we looked at time taken in between points, and I was surprised by the fact that he was rushing points, like he was taking less time after losing a point than when he won it, and just how he really didn't play that first point in return games very well, and something you looked at, Marc.
Yeah, and obviously looking at the numbers, obviously was rushing too much under pressure, and when he took his time, obviously winning the next point was obviously significant. So we had to implement that into his routines. It was more of a mental based bit of data than anything else. It wasn't anything to do with the way he played. It was just the sheer panic that he had under pressure. And obviously, when you go to the next slides and we look at how we significantly changed the way he played, I looked at a couple of things Shane gave me when I first met this player. Was he was only winning 0.81 of a game out of the first 4 games on average. And then that significantly changed. We changed a few things, and that changed to 2.12 games out of the first 4. And what we did to change that was around his mindset, around his pre-match preparation, around his pre-match diet. And everything had to change to get this result a little bit differently. And I felt like this worked really well. And this is a really small space of time that we made a huge inroad in, obviously going back to our action constraint slide from earlier. But I think that the change that we made here was a confident change. It didn't need much, but we needed to get him on the court, warm up better, have a better hit, have a higher intensity in the hit. Obviously, have a diet that was he wasn't eating from the hitting warm up through to the match and then having no food. So his decline was quite significant as well. So we needed to change that and have a little bit of a snack in between the pre-match hit and the match. And obviously during the match needed to increase the amount of food intake as well because his fuel stocks were dropping. But this was a really big change. It was quite an interesting statistic that Shane did bring to me. We made quite significant inroads into his match play. So I guess, like in summary, Shane, the biggest things that the coaches are going to take away, obviously, and we're not all going to have access to someone like yourself, and that's probably one of the big things. And from a junior level, a lot of my junior players wouldn't be able to afford a lot of data, but they'll be able to afford some data. It could be just an app, it could be a parent taking stats, it could be some live statistics that they use. In between their training sessions, their coach might stat matches in practice sets. You might be able to video matches and watch back. But, I think it's important that we use some sort of data to quantify what we're actually trying to teach our players. And it gives them the ability to see it from a visual perspective, the improvement levels. Now, we look at video sometimes as being significant, but numbers also show the things that we're doing well and the things that we aren't. And I think that if we can actually get some factual information in front of our players, they'll get more buy into our philosophy and the way we go about it. And we're able to then prioritize our training a lot better. And coaching is an art backed by science. And that's what I want people to walk away with today is that, we need to be very smart in the way we go about it. The art's going to drive things, but also we're backed by science and backed by factual information. And that's what you bring to the table for me is, you give me that backing that allows me to obviously get the buy-in from athletes a lot more.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, this is a great slide really to touch on the points that we made throughout the presentation. I really think the capturing the data, the technology is evolving and it's getting to a stage where it is more affordable. So keep an eye out for different sort of apps that are being released that are making the life of a parent and coach easier to capture this data.
Absolutely. And, obviously that's what we all we have time for today. And we do appreciate you listening into us. Obviously it's a short space of time. We try to jam pack a lot to show you and to give you a lot of examples of the things that you can possibly do. The question you'll ask yourself is, how can I do that without having someone like Shane? Well, you can have someone like Shane. Shane's details are on there on the screen, and you can have access to people like Shane. But also, there are so many apps you can use to gain even the smallest bits of data around first serve percentage or winning ratio, or how many times you break serve or what you're doing under pressure. There's so many things you can do to give you some measurable numbers for your athlete to be able to look at. And we've had some great success together as a partnership, and that's what it is. It's the art and the science coming together to create a great partnership. And we hope we've left you better than we found you. We thank you so much for listening in. And if there's any questions, please feel free to hit us up.
Yeah. Thanks everyone for listening. Thanks Tennis Australia for inviting, and thanks Marc for helping me through my first coaches conference presentation.
Thanks for being a part of it, Shane. And thank you all for listening in. And we hope you've enjoyed the presentation. Thank you to everyone at Tennis Australia for the invite.